Our next speaker is going to be Cindy Stafford. The title of her paper is Eloise Turner, quote, I'll honeymoon at the Glen Canyon. Cindy worked as a speech therapist in New Mexico, Utah, and Page, Arizona. She's done a lot of hiking with her husband, Kern Nuttall, in the Southwest, where they have a passion for canyon country landscape and for the history. She worked as an interpretive ranger for Glen Canyon for 10 years, and in 2015, she published a Grand Canyon cemetery map and did research for Kern's book called A Better Place, Cemeteries and Grave Sites of Grand Canyon. She volunteers presently at the Museum Collection of Glen Canyon.
I'll honeymoon at Grand Canyon, so exclaimed Eloise Fain upon first seeing the canyon view not far from this site almost 100 years ago. But it would be a couple of years before she had a viable marriage offer, followed by the derailment from a life-threatening illness, paralysis, and relearning to walk. An additional 10 years intervened after her marriage before Eloise managed that hoped-for Grand Canyon experience with her husband. And little did she know that in the future they would come to live there for 17 years. But first, she had to find her way to Arizona. She grew up in Shepard, Texas. She was the oldest of 4 living children, and she passed the state teacher's exam at age 17. She was too young to teach without a waiver. A change in political winds left her postmaster father unemployed. Come work for the Katy Lumber Company in McNairy, Arizona, said a relative. So in 1926, the family packed up, squeezed their brood into a Model T, and headed west with Eloise at the wheel. Her mother insisted that she drive. An ill-placed rock in the road near Elephant Butte Dam in New Mexico proved to be the only obstacle. 2 years before, the entire town of McNairy, Louisiana, had been relocated 1,000 miles to the west, to the White Mountains of Arizona, where pines were plentiful. The company had no choice. They had cut down all the trees. It was located on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation where the Forest Service reigned. 500 African Americans had also relocated from Louisiana. They lived in an area known as the Hill. McNairy was a segregated community, a company lumber town. So the whites, the African Americans, and the Mexicans had separate schools, cafes, and churches. And natives and I think Navajos and Apaches lived in some primitive structures. There were also probably bunkhouses at the 3 nearby lumber camps that supplied the trees for processing. Meanwhile, Eloise settled in at Arizona State Teachers College in Flagstaff to complete her teaching credentials in this state. She participated in plays, she wrote for the newspaper, and she gave dainty dance performances and went on field trips like to Grand Canyon and Grand Falls. She graduated in 1927, and she began teaching in McNairy. The summer of 1928 found Eloise traveling back to Houston by train as a delegate for the contentious Democratic National Convention. A neighbor advised, see Sam Turner to fix your ticket at the Holbrook Depot. But Sam was not around the day that she arrived, and she went back the next day, and he still wasn't there. And so an older gentleman in the office helped her with her ticket. But Sam finally showed up and introduced himself as she was getting on the train, and evidently he had checked her out. At the convention, New York Governor Al Smith earned the nomination. He was the first Catholic in a major party to run, and his opposition to prohibition was a second strike against him for groups like the influential Ku Klux Klan. Herbert Hoover won the election, riding the waning wave of 1920s prosperity. Despite a beau in McNairy And renewing old acquaintances in Houston, Eloise sent a telegram to Sam Turner, on a return, asking for a red cap. And it was a joke, since the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad had none at Holbrook, unless you counted on Sam for help with baggage. Their first date was the night of her return, and by October, she wore an engagement ring. A typhoid fever epidemic broke out in the winter of 1929. As Dr. Sharp noted, there were several illnesses that winter, but typhoid fever cases were undoubtedly underreported by at least half. The official tally was 65 cases and 6 deaths. In hindsight, findings like pneumonia and encephalitis that were listed as the cause of death before typhoid fever was confirmed in the community were actually probably the result of typhoid fever. The bacteria were transmitted in food and water, often from poor sanitary conditions. As soon as typhoid fever was eventually confirmed, the company posted warning signs to recommend boiling water in milk. But it was too late. Eloise got sick towards the end of January, and weeks of debilitating fever followed, GI upset. She was bedridden, eventually paralyzed, and she had very severe weight loss. She claimed that her weight got down to 59 pounds. And although she did not drink milk, milk was delivered to her household. And as William Osler in 1935 textbook on medicine points out, that freezing doesn't kill the bacteria. And so if she ate ice cream or used butter or other milk materials, and of course the water in the home, could have caused the disease. Her sister also had the disease, and she could have gotten it from one of her students. Sam managed to get her admitted to the Santa Fe Railroad Hospital, shown here in Los Angeles, even though they were just engaged and she wasn't yet his family member. As Osler points out, this kind of paralysis usually gets better, may take a couple of years, and the best treatment is just massage. So she was in the hospital here for 5 months following a few months of bedridden at home. And Sam would take the night train from Holbrook on his only day off to the Santa Fe Hospital, visit her during the day, and then ride the train at night back, so he would be at work the next day. Eloise said, "It was a long, long period of a lot of tender, loving care and exercising that helped me learn to walk again." She told Sam over and over, "You don't have to go through with this." And he told her that he would marry her even if he had to carry her down the aisle. They were married in Holbrook early in 1930. At the time, it was touted as too tough for women or churches. And they lived there for several years. She was able to walk during her wedding, but she had used crutches and then a cane. She brought some lawsuits against the company, claiming that the water delivered to her father's home was contaminated. And in Prescott Courthouse in 1931, a 12-man jury awarded her $27,500. But the company, of course, had a lot of lawyers, and they were able to successfully argue that the percentage of homes receiving milk had the highest cases. And since the white homes had the indoor plumbing, they had the best sanitation, it was the milk that they were convinced caused whites to have twice as many typhoid fever cases as African American families, and 8 times as many cases as the Mexican families. The groups, interestingly enough, with the porous sanitation, that is the native communities and the lumber camps, had absolutely no typhoid cases diagnosed. The couple's only child, Sam Jr., was born late in 1934 in Holbrook, and the company followed Sam's career with the railroad, first east to Gallup, New Mexico, and then west to Ash Fork for a couple of years each, before finally coming to the Grand Canyon, where Sam was station agent. And they were here for 17 years. Sammy enrolled in first grade. They lived over the depot in the apartment and right in the middle of the village. And news of Pearl Harbor marked their first anniversary, and Eloise talked about the paralyzing announcement that heralded so many changes in the lives of railroad employees, and a lot were laid off. They took cars off the train. And now, instead of tourists, the trains carried soldiers to the rest camps that were here. And I like the photo on the right. In 1939, there were military training exercises over the canyon. When a teacher at the two-room schoolhouse resigned to join the Waves, Eloise became a substitute teacher. She commented that the war was a leveler, the entire community was united in whatever they did, and that it was, I think there were only about 300 people in the village at that time. And in her own words,
we went at a very good time to become part of the community because the war came on so soon. And as I say, I never felt that anybody thought there was any difference between Fred Harvey and Santa Fe and Park Service people. To me, they were just people.
Sure.
The community building hosted movies. It was the heart of the community with square dances, plays, card games, church on Sunday mornings, and Liberty bond drives. Sam Jr. remembers the family listening to the popular radio shows of the day in those evenings, and he remembers reading Worlds in Collision with his father. His mother liked to read Book of the Month Club, and Sam had bought a piano for Eloise when they lived in Ash Fork, and they brought it to the canyon, and continual playing was really good physical therapy for her hands. Several parents convinced her to teach their children piano lessons, even though she didn't feel like she was a piano teacher. The Turners are shown in the photo on the left with Eloise and Sam. Their best friends were the Shellbacks, and also Superintendent Harold Bryant and his wife Amy. They enjoyed that nightly ritual of watching the sunset from Hopi Point, and even the children whispered. They didn't have to be told. They also enjoyed the wildlife of the canyon, like this little sparrowhawk on the left. One summer morning, before Eloise had gotten out of bed, she felt the building shake a little bit, and she thought, oh, somebody just backed slightly into the loading dock downstairs. But a few months later, when they had announced the Trinity atomic bomb test in New Mexico, she realized that was the date she had felt that. Friends of the family had been POWs in a Japanese prison camp in the Philippines, and they vowed, if we ever get out of here, we're going to go to Havasupai Canyon. So Sam Turner arranged for horses from the village to meet them at the hilltop, and Eloise was able to ride down to the falls and go through the tunnels at Mooney Falls. Her son commented that she was very careful about her walking. One of her heels did not touch the floor, but she could wear shoes that would compensate. She had put her crutches away for a cane, and her cane when she was at the canyon. Sam Jr. graduated from 8th grade. There was no high school here at the time, so he went away to Mount Pleasant, Utah, to Wasatch Academy. And Eloise began working part-time for the transportation department as a secretary. And one of her jobs that she enjoyed was keeping the life history of the mules. A large group of Fred Harvey employees worked as drivers as well as mule guides. And Eloise's boss was Curly Ennis, shown on the mule on the left, and John Bradley on the right played in the cowboy band at Bright Angel Lodge. Eloise began writing regular columns for the Fred Harvey Hospitality magazine and the Santa Fe magazine for the railroad. And she also worked as a stringer for United Press International, which occasionally picked up her stories. We owe her a great debt. She documented people and what they did that otherwise would be lost to us. In September of 1951's Hospitality, she wrote about Dick Mueller's 30-year career with Fred Harvey, mostly as a blacksmith for the mules. Eloise marveled at his mule memory, as she called it, that he once made mule shoes for 15 mules stationed at the North Rim, and only one out of the 60 needed any adjustment, that's how well he knew the mules. Victor Petroso passed away in 1952, and she wrote about him in the Hospitality spring issue. He had a 40-year career with Fred Harvey, 23 years as the manager of El Tovar. He was known as Mr. Grand Canyon, and he demanded fresh flowers daily from the greenhouse at El Tovar, but he could mingle equally with the lowest paid employee or a king or a president. We're really fortunate to know about George Murakami thanks to Eloise. In the Hospitality of September 1954, she wrote that he grew up in Hawaii diving for tourist coins. And after travels to New York and Australia, he came to Grand Canyon because Victor Petroso liked hiring Japanese-American bellhops. He joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Go for Broke team, earning a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. He was very active in the Grand Canyon American Legion. And he rose to bell captain at El Tovar, and he worked for more than 20 years here before going to LA and working at Union Station. When former General Dwight Eisenhower and his wife Mamie came to visit, he was then president of Columbia University. This is prior to his US presidency a couple years later. George Murakami related his World War II experience to Ike, and Ike commented, "You boys did a swell job," which meant the world to George. Superintendent Bryant's wife, Amy, drafted Eloise to help serve Prince Faisal's entourage at a tea party at her house. Eloise never forgot the 7-foot-tall Ethiopian bodyguard or the gold jewel-encrusted scimitar that he carried. And Prince Faisal is there in the middle. Buford Bellegarde ran the laundry. He was written up in the October 1955 issue of Hospitality and his new laundry equipment. He had 27 summer employees that turned out a record 12,000 hotel linens in a single day, and they only used 17,000 gallons of water. Some events, Shirley Yarbury. His 36-year career, end of the trail, was 1957. And we mentioned the cottonwood trees earlier. Well, they were planted by Shorty Yarbury, and that's a legacy that remains. Some events garnered national headlines and attention, like the Boy Scout Jamboree of 1953. August Santa Fe magazine, Eloise wrote about their 8 days of coming to the canyon. A much sadder incident involved the 1956 dual airline crash near the Little Colorado River, then the eastern boundary of Grand Canyon National Park. Eloise filed the first story before every major newspaper sent reporters to cover this tragedy. The eyes of the world watched for a few tense weeks as the enormity of loss of life and the recovery of remains from such a remote location took place. The Turner family's 17th year at Grand Canyon ended with bittersweet memories. Sam was less than a year away from retirement when his doctor sent him to the Santa Fe Hospital in LA in 1957 because of heart symptoms. He was beginning to feel better after his return, but he died after taking a walk with Eloise. And she commented that he always felt he would be the last Grand Canyon agent. And he's buried in the cemetery, the Pioneer Cemetery next door. And a happier event awaited, though, in June when Sam Jr. married his South Rim romance gal. Eloise returned to school and earned her master's, and she taught for several years, first in Baghdad and then in Clarkdale, where her sister and mother lived, and she co-authored a children's book. When she passed away, her ashes were scattered at Shoshone Point, and a plaque was placed next to her husband's in the cemetery. And we owe her such a great debt because learning her story allows us to travel back to northern Arizona in the 1920s when lumber and railroad companies dominated a segregated community. Thanks to her transcripts of the trial, we can understand the dynamics of a typhoid fever outbreak. And her interviews and articles document stories and people and their contributions, and they speak to us still. Thank you.